Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa, and welcome in to the Hoon for Thursday, the 12th of September. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host with fellow co-host Peter Bale. Peter, how are you?
I'm very good, Bernard. Thank you. It's getting a little colder over here. I'm sure it is there as well, which is not supposed to do because I want spring. I want it to be fully spring, and then I want it to be summer. I think I've been suffering from seasonal affective disorder.
We're going to have some cold weather. The polar blast is coming. There's talk of like snow in Auckland, and there's some weird weather happening all over the world.
Yeah, well, thank God we've got an excellent climate session coming up with
Yes.
Catherine. Shall we talk a little bit about what we've got on the show today?
Yes, indeed.
Sorry,
You go.
No, I've got this fabulous pair of people coming on who cover the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And they're two women. They have a fantastic podcast called Asymmetrical Haircuts. And they cover the court. One of them covers it for Reuters, but really they bring together their experience and their knowledge on their podcast. And I thought with the imminence, apparently, of war crimes claims against Netanyahu and Hamas leaders, that it would be really interesting to have them on to talk about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, what the difference is between the two. And Robert Patman will be in for just a few minutes or in there as well, because I thought it'd be quite fun for him to meet them. And then in our New Zealand section, which you've kind of allowed me to organise today, partly because you were away last week, and I thought you might burst a gasket trying to put it all together.
Thank you. Yeah, no,
other things.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Is Vincent O'Malley, the New Zealand historian, who I've gotten to know a little bit, and I really admire his work. I read quite a lot of his books. In fact, I studiously put one behind me here on a little plinth to show, so that he would see that we loved him. And he's a really terrific guy, and I think he's also not afraid to go into some of the political questions that are so live at the moment about Maoridom, Te Ao Māori, Te Reo Māori for that matter, and Maori's place in Maori's place in our politics, really, particularly. And he was at he's very knowledgeable on the Kingitanga movement, and so he'll talk about that. And we'll also give him space to talk about his new book, which I will encourage. In fact, if we were a proper podcast, Bernard, we'd have one of those, go to thekaka.com/Hoon, and they get a discount on the Bridget Williams book.
Oh, that's clever.
We might have to work out how to do that in the future.
You're thinking like an entrepreneur. I love it.
Like
I love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I indeed have a copy of the book too to show off to people.
The new one. The new one, have you?
Yes, I do. So
good.
That's going to be great, from Bridget Williams' books, and put a link in the show
Jesus,
notes.
we don't want to give them any. I mean, Bridget Williams is. I mean, I'm sure I'm sure it's a gigantic enterprise. We don't want to give her any freebies.
No, I'm afraid they're not competing with Rupert Murdoch to be the world's biggest book supplier. These guys need help. And it's an amazing book and series of books that he's written. And, you can't imagine our view of ourselves being as it is without the work of people like Vincent O'Malley.
This one is pretty chunky. This has been out for a while. And what I said to him the other day was, do I really need to buy today's one, the latest one that's about Waikato, when I've got this? And he said, absolutely, of course. There's a whole range of new material.
Yeah,
I've got another one sitting at, not exactly that one, but I've got another one sitting in my car with tabs on it so that I can drive around and find the various sites that he mentions and describes.
Oh, yeah.
So it's better than a road map. So if you go to somewhere like Rangireiri, he's got the descriptions of the war. You can see of the battles and so on, and particularly Northland, Tainui region, Waikato is pretty amazing.
Yes, and you've written about this for the listener as well. Which
I did. That's right.
Yes.
I did a piece. I mentioned that when I get to Vincent, because one of the things I want to talk to him about is the sort of surprises that he He's he's very contemporary about his history. We should perhaps get Anne Salmond on sometime as well, who has also been hugely influential on me at least. And what
Absolutely.
have you? So, did you watch the debate yesterday, Bernard?
I did. I went down the road and sat down with
What, to a
my
pub?
other boomer mates to watch the political debate, as you do, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was great fun. Uh, in a sort of a seat of the pants, chew your nails off. Let's hope that it doesn't go horribly pear-shaped. And as it turned out, it went okay for Kamala Harris,
Bitten,
and
okay, yeah.
she led him on into the traps, and
Yes.
he helpfully jumped in them, and certainly seems to have, well, not derailed, but given him a shunt in the wrong
Were
direction
you
from his point of
surprised,
view.
Bernard? Well, I wasn't so much. Yeah, I guess I was surprised. I thought it was very interesting and an indication of how huge how much the Biden Trump debate changed politics. That RNZ, I think, RNZ definitely streamed it live from ABC. TVNZ, I think, had it on live. It's pretty extraordinary to devote that much of a schedule in a non, we're not Guam.
It is incredibly
Yeah.
consequential. This is the only debate. This is the first chance people have had.
Well, we don't know if it's the only debate because
Really?
she has said that she wants a second one.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And he said, well, if it's on Fox, I definitely don't want Brett Baer and somebody else doing it. I think he's wetting his pants. Actually, he went into. In fact, he was a study in furious concentration and the attempt to contain. He did look as though he was about to burst a gasket at various points. He's not.
Keep
very
prodding
good
him
at-
too, hoping that he would. It was good.
Yes.
And I mean, it is a big deal. We are in the process as a nation thinking about joining up with America, essentially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Being a security partner, in theory, to contain, if not oppose, our largest trading partner. And who's in charge in the next 4 or 5 years or so, possibly 8 years, will be incredibly influential for us. Not only that, but also the planet. Catherine Dyer, welcome to the show.
Nice segue,
Catherine,
Bernard. Hi,
lovely to
Catherine.
see you. Because
There was what 8 minutes? Did you say was devoted to the climate, and it was
8 minutes,
mostly
no, 48
devoted
seconds.
in the debate to how much oil America is producing, and that it's currently producing a record amount. Yeah, thanks, Kamala.
And 50% more oil than Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Now. And also an awful lot of gas. Catherine, lovely to see you, our climate correspondent, and we'll put out a weekly climate wrap soon. But tell us about how a President Trump would be different to a President Harris from a climate point of view.
Yeah, from a climate point of view, that makes a huge difference. So, I mean, it's not like Trump has a coherent policy really around climate change, but as Bill McKibben points out in his column this week, from the gibberish that Trump has to say about climate change, you can use Project 2025 to kind of translate some of that gibberish into actual
I don't even know the
policies.
people who created that. It never existed. Never in it.
That's what Trump says, yeah. Except they actually worked for him, yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're busy translating his gibberish into actual policies. And if those policies were to come to pass, then yeah, it does make a significant difference when he's talking about, getting rid of any incentives for renewable energy transition and approving more in terms of oil and gas and so on. He can change the tailpipe requirements for light vehicles, and there's a lot of things he can do. There's last time that he was in, a lot of people sort of commented that the momentum was kept up by the states in terms of getting continuing to have emissions reductions, and there is some stuff that's set in train that it wouldn't be easy for him to undo. At the same time, there is the risk that he just puts, that he has a lot more effective policies ready to go, and people with a plan ready to go, and that he actually does put a bit more of a spoke in the wheel of those states who are trying to keep the ball rolling. I mean, we know from our own experience in New Zealand when it comes to kind of multi-level governance around climate that it can be very, very effective, but it does rely in a lot of places on having support from your central or federal government, and if that support disappears, then that can really stuff up what's happening at other levels. That can
It
really
was interesting,
stymie.
Catherine, that he mentioned also the idea that he would prevent Chinese electric cars being brought in from Mexico, which might make the Mexican free trade agreement, a little North American free trade agreement, a little difficult to implement. But I was reading also that the U.S. green industry, if you like, the electrical industry, the electric car industry, and others in that sphere are very concerned about him sending negative messages, and that, as in several other countries, electric car sales are starting to fall.
Yeah, well, there is a comment thread along the lines that a lot of other countries are waiting to make their new NDC, nationally determined contribution commitments, until after the American election, and they can see what's going to happen there. So it could very well change the level of ambition that other countries have as well. So, there's a lot of...
When do we do what's the timeline for New Zealand to declare its NDC?
I'm not sure what it is at the moment. I have to look it up, but it'll be around... I know that every country was sort of under some obligation to put one forward after the global stock take, which just happened running into the last COP. So the next COP, they would be looking to have at least a few NDCs across the line. So I'm not sure exactly.
My understanding is that the consultation is happening later this year, and it'll be next year when the government has to come up with something. So it'll be after we know whether it's Trump or Harris. And it is so important because the global car industry still very much takes its lead from the United States. And particularly trade relations with China are so important. China has got this enormous factory capacity now and is pumping it all out. And one of the most sad things around trade relations at the moment is that Europe and the United States are both putting big tariffs on, and it's not just Trump, it's also Biden who's done it, and Harris will do the same, to try to protect their own solar and EV industries from the enormous production that's coming out of China. And sadly, by putting those tariffs in, it's going to slow down the adoption of EVs and solar and batteries. And
interestingly, I saw the other day a comment about China is changing their requirements for tailpipe emissions so that they will phase out all 100% fossil fuel vehicles by 2026.
Yeah.
So in the next couple of years, they're looking to move to either hybrids or
That's pretty
EVs.
extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
That is extraordinary. And there's also this idea that, the renewable transition is being led by China, and that just gives them a much bigger advantage in that sense. If you are, by taking that tariff route.
Yeah, no, it's a real problem for the world. Apart from, if Trump gets in, he's not only promising to put 100% tariff on Chinese goods, but a whole bunch of tariffs on other goods. And one of his weirdest policies that's come up in the last week or so is this idea that he's going to punish with more tariffs anyone who isn't using the US dollar as their main currency for trade. Which, nuts really, because of course it's still the dominant currency in the world, and the people who aren't using it are basically the Russians and the Chinese trading with each other in renminbi. So it was fairly bad when Trump was in last time, but I think you're right about Project 2025, Catherine. I think the Republicans were sort of shocked that Trump was in and felt like they couldn't control him and they didn't have a plan for him to implement. But this time around they have. And, things like banning the use of the phrase climate change in all sorts of government documents following the dumb legislation that Florida put through. So there is a real risk there. And I've seen the analysis, Catherine, that, we're talking billions of extra tons of emissions, the assumed difference between Trump and Kamala Harris. Although, listening to the 48 seconds in the debate the other night, Catherine, Kamala Harris wasn't coming over all green like, her response when asked about the climate was to talk about, what did she talk about?
Yeah, it's really interesting that she was talking so much about gas, and obviously very keen to make that point that she wasn't going to pull the plug on all of that gas development, which is something that she's talked about in the past. And so what that suggests is what, well, certainly the independent voters, or the ones that are uncertain at the moment, what they're interested in or what they're concerned about, and it doesn't sound like it's climate change. So that gives you, because there would be a lot of research going on behind the scenes into her positions on these things in terms of trying to win the presidency. So that's taking a temperature of the public in America and what they are concerned or not concerned about, and that's quite worrying as well.
The power of the gas and the coal and the oil lobbies in the United States to shape the public opinion with billions of dollars of spending on PR basically, and it's infected right through the media complex.
Well, also education, because I've got a link in this week's climate wrap as well that looks at the amount of. There was a study looking at the amount of funding from fossil fuel industry or interests into higher education, into universities, and they're saying that the lack of transparency in terms of the partnerships that are going on, the funding partnerships between fossil fuel interests and universities, is problematic, and that it's not giving them, they're not able to trace well exactly what's happening and the degree to which that's influencing the kind of studies that get done in the first place and how they get communicated and how they get used to influence policy at government level. So, it's not just media that's, involved here. It's also what influence they're having over higher education.
Yep, and we saw that with our own government. The first thing the government did when there was talk about energy shortages was go straight to gas. Catherine Dyer, thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks very much.
Over to you, Peter.
And may I welcome two remarkable women from a fabulous podcast. I'm trying not to do that one podcast having another one to interview, but I'd like to welcome Janet and Stephanie from Asymmetrical Haircuts, which is a fabulous and rather pointy-headed but extremely interesting podcast from The Hague. Stephanie, I don't think we actually crossed paths, and Reuters. Bernard is a Reuters person too, ex-Reuters person too. You're the Reuters correspondent covering the Court of Justice in The Hague, correct?
Yeah, I have always been a big legal geek, and I started following the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and kind of got my way into being the permanent Reuters correspondent in The Hague, and thus
Nice
the
work.
kind of point person for international justice things.
Excellent. And Janet, I think you started in this area with Rwanda, correct? And you're more
That's right.
on the sort of campaign and justice side of that. Is that right? I mean, I know Asymmetrical Haircuts is a very straight piece of work, but your background is more as a justice campaigner, correct?
Well, because I've had to move around the world at different times, freelance journalism has had to be supplemented by making use of my skills in different ways. So I am also a moderator, and I'll tell people how to talk to journalists.
Excellent. And we can see that you're modelling the asymmetrical haircut that the show is named after.
I am.
Stephanie, less so today.
Less so. The lockdown has got me, and now I make the joke that I have a secondary trauma bangs.
And the asymmetrical haircuts phrase, or what came from Sharon Stone, is that correct? Tell us about that quickly.
Well, it came more because we really didn't want to call something as boring as justice, accountability, litigation. I mean, really, the number of organizations who have boring names. So let's find something fun and different. And we joked together about there being this haircut of international justice. And I joked about how when I'd met Sharon Stone, we'd had the same haircut. So, the idea was born.
Yeah, well, I won't tell you the stories that I know about Sharon Stone from her former husband, but they're pretty good. Now, onto the subject, and we've got Professor Robert Patman, our fabulous guest in international affairs from Otago on. I've told him that he's going to get slightly squeezed by you, but one of the reasons, and he's only here for about 8 minutes because he's been stolen by another former guest of ours to go and speak at her conference. But one of the reasons I've asked him on is that this whole question of international law, how the Hague courts work, the ICJ and the ICC work, is really important to New Zealand, as I'm sure you know. And Robert is a very strong advocate for international rules-based, or talks a lot about international rules-based systems, and the role that small countries like New Zealand, or relatively small countries like New Zealand, can play in gathering communities of like-minded countries behind them. So I thought it would be really... Robert, you've got Janet and Stephanie from Asymmetrical
Janet. Hi,
Haircuts,
Stephanie.
which
Hey, yeah.
I've already
Hi.
plugged.
Good evening,
Now,
Peter.
good evening. One of the reasons I wanted you on, and just to talk about a particularly contemporary story, is that we're expecting, I believe, this week for the International Criminal Court to, or at least this month, to issue its cases against Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, and several leaders of Hamas, assuming some of them are still alive. Can you just tell us a little bit about the background to that case and where you think it's going at the moment?
Well, I
Steph,
think
do
the
you want
I
to
ICC.
do-
know, Robert.
Oh,
I mean that.
Okay,
I mean the women
Robert,
in the
to
Hague.
start with. Sorry.
No, sorry.
No. Please go ahead. He always he can't.
Well,
No.
yeah.
Janet and Stephanie, please go ahead and tell us what that news is, please.
Oh, well, I've always been taught that it's the death of a show to fact check somebody live on the air, but I'm going to be a legal
That's
geek
fine.
and do it anyway. So what we're expecting the ICC to do this month or kind of soonish is to issue arrest warrants that the prosecutor has asked for, and indeed he's asked for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, the defense minister Yoav Gallant of Israel, and 3 Hamas leaders, 2 of whom are now believed to have been killed. So there's but one is
That's
not
one way
quite
to solve
certain.
that problem, isn't it?
So we have probably two Hamas arrest warrants that are still pending. And what the judges then will do is they have to look if there's reasonable grounds for the accusations that the prosecutor makes, and then you have an arrest warrant. But that is not to be confused with it being an indictment, because the ICC doesn't actually issue indictments. What happens is you have an arrest warrant, then when people get arrested and transferred to The Hague, and we can talk about how difficult that will be, then there is still a confirmation of charges hearing. And so the charges then go through another round of judges looking at them. And only when those charges are confirmed, you have what we would kind of see as an indictment.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose we saw last week the difficulty of getting people on these charges with Vladimir Putin turning up in Mongolia, which is a signatory to the ICC, but declined to arrest him.
Well, that's the main problem. Is Janet can jump in here about how everybody agrees that they should comply with the ICC, but in reality, Janet?
Yeah, in reality, it depends how big or small a country you are and who your neighbours are. And there's no enforcement procedure for the ICC. There's nowhere for them to go to except to all of the states who have signed up, including New Zealand. So we've got a big meeting. There's the annual meeting in December. So I expect Mongolia will get a bit of a slap on the wrist. What's happened in previous cases, that was with the former president of Sudan, Bashir. We had a thing called Bashir Watch, where we're all watching to see exactly which country would turn up in. And it was actually litigated before the court a little bit about who had what obligations. So, we know that they are obliged, but whether they do it.
And when the problem
one critical aspect.
Sorry, the problem for not obliging is at best you get a diplomatic slap on the wrist, either from all the other ICC members, or they could send it to the UN Security Council.
The ICC... I'm sorry, Stephanie, I think I lost you there for a minute. Thank you. Could you explain, I mean, a little bit, I have explained it on the show before, but the difference between the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice, which is traditionally, I think, what we've called the World Court. Janet?
Okay, my deal is individuals, ICC, individual criminal responsibility, states. You've got to sign up to the ICC. In some forms, you have to sign up to the ICJ because it's all full of treaties, but it's the highest UN court, so basically everybody's a member.
Great. And so we've got a very controversial time at the moment where, there's been claims that Israel has been putting undue pressure on the judiciary of the ICJ and the ICC. It's a very febrile. Have you had a time like this before when it's been this febrile, where the contested groups have been so strong and so active in their attempts to undermine the courts?
Well, only once before, but that were the same group. So in 2004, there was an advisory opinion at the International Court of Justice about Israel's building of a security wall, and that was the same atmosphere and emotions. But I often say to some of the colleagues covering the same things, this is the conflict with the highest emotions on all sides, with the most reaction and bitterness also on the internet and reactions to what we write, that it's really in that sense unprecedented, but of course not the level of violence and destruction we see, because there's plenty of other conflicts that have that, they just don't get the same attention.
Yes.
Apart from
Robert,
the febrile atmosphere,
I'm sorry.
Peter, just
Go
apart
ahead.
from the
Sorry.
febrile
No.
atmosphere, there's also just this sense that suddenly international law is this big thing.
Yeah.
We've got Ukraine, Russia, and we've got Israel, Palestine. Whoosh! The whole world suddenly looking at our world, where we've been living for a long while, going plod. Let's just cover what's going on, and then suddenly everybody comes in, and everybody has an opinion, which I'm sure Robert has as well. We're women's-plaining Robert at the moment.
Not at all.
That's
sure
fine.
Robert
I'm
loves
enjoying
being
it.
women's plained. Yeah, good. Robert, having heard what you have, and I know you have to go in a little while, but maybe you can put it into, either ask them a question or put it into context for New Zealand.
Well, I think, I agree with the points being made. And I think sometimes some decision makers, particularly in great powers, often regard international law as a bit of an add-on, that's something that can be worked around. I think this is a real tension building up in the 21st century between, I think, the middle powers and the small powers, which by definition do depend on international relations to be based on rules rather than raw power. And I think there's an opportunity for the smaller and the middle powers to press on this issue, because there's a fair amount of debate in the United States, not enough, unfortunately. I think in the United States there's often a confusion between what may be said informally as the US rules-based system and the international rules-based system. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because I do think the majority of countries in the world have a huge stake in international relations being based on rules and laws. And in a sense, what we're witnessing in both the Ukraine and Gaza has huge ramifications for the shape of the world going forward in the 21st century. The reason I think international law is coming into its own is because we hear all about great power rivalry and about states asserting themselves, whether it be in Ukraine or Gaza. But there's another side to this coin which is often neglected, and that is, in the 21st century, many of the problems piling up can only be resolved through international cooperation. That is self-interested international cooperation. And the sort of problems we're talking about are climate change, global pandemics, transnational terrorism. We had one country have a unilateral stab at that, and it didn't work out very well. And in short, in the post-Cold War era, there's very few examples of successful unilateral action by great powers. Now, the penny hasn't quite dropped, but when I say that, I mean that the great powers have to come to terms with the fact they can't run the world. If they could, they would. They cannot. And the alternative
Jennifer,
is...
I think you want to come in and tell Robert is
I
talking a lot of our bollocks.
want to break in and agree with what Robert said, and just add in this kind of word of flex. There's this big flex going on at the moment of small states, including places like New Zealand, who are saying, where are the spaces where we can have power? Oh my goodness, we're actually equal in the General Assembly. We're not in the Security Council, because that's run by, people who don't agree with each other, but in the General Assembly, and then also at a place like the ICJ, and they're using that space. So at the end of this year, we have the very big climate change discussions, which I'm sure will be very interesting to New Zealand. So many countries in the world are going to have their say there because they can.
Is that just to go back a little bit to the Israel case and the genocide case? Can we clear up a couple of things? I mean, because of course that is an example of South Africa using its. I mean, it's bigger than New Zealand, but it's not a superpower, using its leverage through the ICIJ, and of course there's that other aspect where it is rather extraordinary for the crime of genocide to be leveled against Israel, given the history of the origin of the word genocide. I mean, can you just tell us a little bit about the word? I've read Philippe Sand's book about it, and I know the origins of it. Tell us a little bit about the importance of that word.
Steph, over to you, genocide expert.
Oof. I think one of the things to really think about is, yes, genocide is a big word, and it is something that we really haven't seen before, it being leveled against Israel, while the Holocaust was part of the kind of coming into existence of the Genocide Treaty. But I think also you have to look at that the ICJ works with the treaties it's given. So there is no crimes against humanity or war crimes treaty that you could bring before the ICJ. There is only the Genocide Treaty. So in South Africa, in looking at what you could use in this kind of lawfare, bringing a case to an international court, the only recourse it had was the Genocide Treaty. And so that you make a big kind of announcement with that. I also want to clear up, there's this whole question of whether the court said that there was a plausible, that
Yes,
it was
that was
plausible
my
that
next
there was.
question. Thank you.
Yes.
So tell us about
And
the use
so-
of the word plausible, because that's so important.
Well,
Thank
it's
you.
a little different than it gets shorthanded into.
Thank you, Robert.
And
Sorry.
Bye,
Thank you.
Robert.
No worries.
Bye.
It's a little different than it gets shorthanded into, and so the court didn't actually say there's a plausible risk of genocide. They said there is a plausible risk, or in the language of the court, a not implausible risk, that rights that the Palestinians have in this case under the Genocide Convention are being violated. Now, of course, of the rights under the Genocide Convention, there is the right not to have a genocide committed against you, but there are also other rights, like not to be the subject of incitement to genocide, which it doesn't actually need, you don't actually need to have a genocide proven to have incitement to genocide. And so there are rights that can be breached in the Genocide Convention that don't actually say that genocide is going on or is being committed. Now, we don't know, and obviously this is the kind of the preamble to everything. This is not the court, these are provisional measures. This is before the court has looked at the case on the merits. They have to, it'll be years before the court rules whether it's genocide, the Genocide Convention was really breached, and then to what extent. So we really can't say anything
No, that's
about
really
that
important,
yet.
because I think people have also conflated the use of the word plausible by the ICJ with that letter, I think from 600 lawyers to the FT, open letter, which talked about a plausible case for genocide. So they've kind of conflated a couple of the two, But one of the things, and we've got a few questions from the audience from as well. I mean, it is correct, isn't it, that the word genocide really only came from 1946 when Lemuel tried to bring it up at the
Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin was actually deeply affected by the Armenian genocide, and that's what really set him off to think about how to construct something. And he went backwards and forwards in his shabby suit in around the United Nations, saying, trying to work out what would work for states. So we have this quite limited, quite stringent convention that a lot of states have signed up to.
Yeah, and it really didn't exist, though, as a crime or even a word until he created it, correct?
The
No,
word
exactly.
is, the word is his invention. I think it's half Greek, half Latin, that some of the classicists argue about. But the crime existed, and there was a crime of kind of trying to wipe out a nationals or a nation, as we saw with Armenia, and now I will get a lot of Turkish people angry at me.
Yes, of course.
But there are examples of it, and he came up with a word for it, and basically after the whole, and he did this even before the horrors of the Second World War were as clear as they were. But then when that was revealed, there was really an impetus to really do something about it, and so that's how he kind of got this treaty against genocide over the line. He made a word for it, and he made it into law partly spurred on by the Second
The
World
guilt.
War.
Janet, you've very
guilt.
politely put up your finger there rather than
I,
just interrupt like I do.
I'm a podcast host. I do my best to keep everybody in line. I was just going to say, Google the page of his doodles where he tried to fit different bits of words together. It's a lovely page to see how he constructed the word genocide.
Yeah, and it's East West Street I thought was an absolutely wonderful book to get to that. And you mentioned that the ICC and ICJ are now such a focus, particularly with Ukraine and with Gaza. It also has led to, the US has not signed up. 12 countries have not signed up to the ICC, and we also saw really strong attacks on the system, on the ICC and the ICJ, with these allegations of genocide, particularly from American politicians. How is it bearing up? How are both organizations bearing up, do you think, to those threats and pressure?
I think that the ICC is the more vulnerable institution, in the sense that it does require states to sign up. It does also require, to be perfectly honest, a lot of support from the United States to conduct a lot of its investigations. Access to satellite material, access to behind the scenes, they're helping actually hide some of the protected witnesses and look after them, because they have a brilliant program of, the US Marshals program looking after protected witnesses. There's all kinds of cooperation with the US. So it's a really tough call for the ICC to be called out on the political level by these Congress people who are so determined to support Israel that they won't allow one iota of criticism against it, and that's the way they perceive it. So it's a tightrope for the ICC. The ICJ, I would say, that's more Stephanie's beat than mine, but it's, everybody's a member more or less, and they just have to they've even had an American president of the judges fairly recently. So the Americans are in the system there.
Bernard, you wanted to come in on that?
No, I'm fascinated with how these international institutions gain power, lose power, become relevant, become irrelevant, in particular because New Zealand, and it's always about us, of course. In New Zealand, Peter Fraser, the then Prime Minister in 1945, was one of the leaders of the small states who campaigned against giving the veto to the main powers. And it was fascinating to see how that played out. And Robert's point about these institutions giving us some sort of power, if you like, in a world of where power politics matters is incredibly important. But I can see how these institutions become really useful tools for reporting and documenting inconvenient truths for the powerful, even if they're not able to bring them to justice.
I wish some people would spend more time actually watching what goes on, though. Stephanie spends, really inordinate amounts of time, and you know how many people are in the newsroom with you when you're covering stuff, Stephanie. Sometimes it's huge, but other times, who's there? It's 2.5 people and a dog. It's really, what's happening?
Absolutely.
Is the dog there for food, or is the dog
Springfield dog?
Emotional support dog is what it is. That is amazing, and I always find it. So I am Dutch, and these institutions are in the Netherlands, and I'm usually the only Dutch journalist who is there consistently in all these cases. And the Dutch newspapers do carry news of what happens at the ICJ, at the ICC, but usually out there foreign news pages and translated from news stories that I write partially, or my colleagues at other big news agencies. And that amazes me that you wouldn't have this interest in this happening in your backyard.
May I
What-
ask you? We have a question from a couple of questions from the audience, and we also have to move in a minute to domestic New Zealand politics, which is actually extremely interesting because we have a wonderful historian called Vincent O'Malley coming on. Ecocide as a potential crime against humanity has been asked. One of our audience is saying, "What's happening with ecocide?" You've got, I think, Vanuatu and other countries pushing the idea of that. Will that come up at
It's a
that climate
bit.
meeting you mentioned, Janet?
Well, two separate things, two separate courts, two separate processes, at least. At the ICC, ecocide is now being put forward by Vanuatu and other states and saying, can you make this the fifth crime? Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crime of aggression, and can we have ecocide, please? Let's see what happens there. It's a very high bar to get that through the ICC. An enormous number of states have to vote yes for it. Separately, Steph, what's happening ICJ climate?
Look at you.
In the
Nice
ICJ, we'll
segue, you
have
guys.
this advisory opinion on what the responsibilities of states are for climate change. Ecocide is not something that the ICJ can look at. For that, you would have to need a separate UN treaty that would grant the ICJ kind of privileges to look at that. I have to say that while ecocide is not a crime under the ICC, it has launched its own kind of policy of looking more into crimes against or environmental crimes as part of crimes against humanity. So they're trying to kind of slot it in sideways and not have a whole new crime for it, but just to kind of fit it into crimes against humanity. And for example, in Ukraine, we know that they're looking at the explosions of the Nova Kakhovka Dam and the environmental damage there, but
Interesting.
nothing has come out yet.
Bernard, did you have another? Were you itching for another one there?
No, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on to the show and illustrating this, the importance of this work, and it's made me curious about what's really going on and how to cover it. Thank you very
And
much.
please remember, the podcast is Asymmetrical Haircuts, which
difficult to spell. Difficult to spell, but it's nothing to do with hair. And please do have us on again if you'd like
we'd love to.
to
Thank you so
explain
much.
maybe
And
what's actually
speaking of-
happening at a particular time.
And speaking of genocide, we're going to talk to New Zealand's leading expert on the what we when I was growing up we called the Maori Wars, but we now call the New Zealand Wars or the Land Wars.
Well,
thank you very much, guys.
We will listen to Vincent with interest and maybe
please do.
maybe nick him for our podcast later.
Yeah, no, he's a lovely chap. He's really smart. See you later.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, Christ, did you hear me call you a lovely chap, Vincent?
I did indeed.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Now, look, I should explain to people how and why you're on in a way, in the sense that I asked you to help me or give me advice about a story I was working on for the listener about the Mercer War Memorial, which turns out to be the turret from the first New Zealand naval ship that George Grey commissioned, the Pioneer, and there's another one at Ngaruawahia, and as we discussed, many Maori see both of them as a kind of middle finger, an historic middle finger pointing back at Maoridom, correct? Or
Yes.
certainly the Waikato.
Yeah, well, these were instruments of war unleashed against Tainui in the 1860s. There's the new book,
Yep.
and there's the one at Ngaruawahia on the cover, wonderful photo by Neil Partington. And the one at Mercer, ironically, became a World War One memorial.
Yes.
And so, this thing that was used against local Māori, it was, became a rallying point. Anzac Day commemorations were held there. And the interesting story in terms of Tainui with World War One is that largely they avoided service in the First World War. Te Puia Hirangi famously said, they tell us to fight for king and country. We've got a king, give us back our country and then we'll go and fight for you. And so conscription was introduced just for Tainui and Taranaki, and large numbers of men were arrested and imprisoned for refusing to serve in that war. So there's a really interesting story there about how this history kind of resonates over generations.
Yeah, and of course that history of not signing up didn't apply in the Second World War, of course, because there were many Tainui present in the Maori battalion, correct?
And by the time of the Second World War, the first Labour government had indicated a willingness to talk to them around some kind of resolution of their grievances relating to the 1860s, and there was a Settlement Act passed in 1946. It wasn't a treaty settlement, but it was some kind of acknowledgement of the wrongs that had been done in the past.
And Vincent, I'm going to slightly flip the questions that I was going to ask you, and we'll address the Kingitanga, please, and Waikato, and the importance of Tainui, and then we'll come back to some of the contemporary issues that we're facing around Te Tiriti, which is what I was keen to talk about. But we'll also talk about your book. So you can. We've already said that Bridget Williams, that vast publishing empire, if they wanted to offer a discount to the many listeners of the Kaka, we could work that out. Or Bernard will just put it in the show notes. This transition, this coronation of a new Maori queen, what significance does that have to wider Maoridom, given that the Kingitanga is largely confined to the Waikato, and what's a little bit of the background? Because I think somebody I talked to the other day, a New Zealander, didn't realise that the Kingitanga really is it's not a national Maori role as such.
Well, I think Māoridom, regardless of whether they give formally a part of the Kingitanga or not, had huge respect for Tuheitia, who became a sort of rallying point, and we saw him convene a number of hui this year to discuss issues that Māori had in concern. So regardless of whether those iwi, are formally part of the Kingitanga or not, I think that it's still an incredibly important symbol of kotahitanga for Māori today. And I mean, at the moment, I think a lot of Māori feel under siege from the government, so that's more important than ever, I think.
Yeah, we do the segues here. Thank you, Vincent. That's a brilliant segue to where we are now. I mean, the Treaty Principles Bill is coming through. You also wanted to talk about what Paul Goldsmith is talking about the seabed and foreshore, and we had Helen Clark on last week talking about that. And in fact, Bernard will explain what she said, which was quite a sort of, from his point of view, quite an interesting shift in her attitude to that. Tell us about the risks from this. I mean, we're now going to have a 6-month debate over something that is already extraordinarily divisive and isn't going to go any further. What's your sense of why this is being unpicked and what the dangers are of it being unpicked?
Well, as you say, it's hugely divisive. It's a pointless exercise in political grandstanding, as far as I can see. And nobody would ever accuse me of being a John Key stan, but one thing I could confidently say is he would never have signed up to a coalition agreement that included the Treaty Principles Bill. And in fact, he included the Te Pāti Māori as part of his government, even when he had the numbers to govern without them. So he was being inclusive in a way that the current kind of direction of this government is not at all. And, today I was looking at the cabinet papers on the Treaty Principles Bill. And boy, they're damning.
Damning of what? Damning of the cabinet, or damning of
damning of the proposal? They say that it's inconsistent with the Treaty of Waitangi. It doesn't accurately reflect Article 2, which affirms the continuing exercise of tēnā tiratanga, and that restricting the rights of iwi and hapu to those specified in legislation can be seen as a direct attack on the rangatiratanga that was confirmed to Māori under the treaty. So this notion that Māori rights are only those that are acknowledged by the Crown is inconsistent with the treaty itself.
Vincent, I'm curious about why Christopher Luxon seems not to have understood the dangerous place he was going by allowing that in the agreement, when, as you say, your National Party under John Key and Bill English welcomed into Pāti Māori when they didn't necessarily have to. And as we heard last week from Helen Clark, the foreshore and seabed legislation of 2011 was actually quite an elegant solution, she said, which she would have signed up to if she'd been given the option way back in 2004. What's different here? Why has the National Party not said right from the start, we're not even going there?
Well, I don't know, is it political naivety? But I think another broader factor here, I think, is that generations of us didn't learn any New Zealand history, so we don't have the context we don't have the tools to understand the situation we're in today without that historical knowledge. Sometimes I think that as part of the induction for new MPs, maybe they should get a compulsory New Zealand history course. Because
Do we know anybody who's written any books about that would be handy for them to?
yeah, I could probably offer a discount for 120 MPs, but
120 exactly.
yeah. I just think there's that lack of understanding of where we are in history and where we've come from, and particularly if you look at over the last 50 years as a nation, we've been grappling with this very difficult history we've had, often imperfectly, but at least we've been striving to deal with the consequences of what happened. Massive land loss, confiscations, invasions, Public Works Act, all sorts of things. And this is a process that, I mean, one of the important aspects of that, I think, to emphasise is that this has been a bipartisan project. And in fact, if you look at, 1995, Doug Graham and Jim Bolger, the first major treaty settlement with Tainui, and then 3 years later with Ngāi Tahu, they led that. Then we had, under John Key's government, Chris Finlayson doing superb work as well with treaty settlements. So up until recently, there has been a bipartisan consensus around this stuff, that it's important, that it matters. And it's not a left-right thing. It's just about doing the right thing as a nation and kind of reconciling
There's also
ourselves.
an element in here, and I know you're not a constitutional lawyer so far as I know, but the role of the judiciary has been extremely important in this as well, because that's how our system works, surely, is through legislation and jurisprudence leading to these unwritten standards or judgments. And I know the partnership element came up to that, which a friend of mine who's a judge says we should always remember was a remark that was akin to partnership. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because there's a myth. I think you're absolutely right about this myth, the New Zealand mythology that that certainly Pākehā grew up with, even people as young as me, has informed, and I think informs incorrectly some of these attitudes. So we need to fix that. That's why we've got you on, in a sense. We'll fix it for the whole population of New Zealand through you. But maybe address that challenge to the fundamentals of the way democracy works in New Zealand, with politicians and the judiciary and, I guess, the Treaty of Waitangi committee.
So the
tribunal, rather.
The first time that the Treaty of Waitangi was ever acknowledged in law was the 1975 Treaty of Waitangi Act, which established the Waitangi Tribunal, and that said that the tribunal was to consider acts or omissions of the Crown that might be contrary to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and it incorporated the Te Reo Māori text and the English version, or some people call it the English draft of that, but it didn't define what those principles were. And so since 1975, the tribunal and the courts have kind of developed a set of key principles around that, and a key moment in that was the 1987 SOE Lands case, where Justice Cook, Lord Cook of Thorndon, as was alluded to, developed that idea of partnership, and there are a number of other key principles such as active protection and so on. And the key thing around these is that they derive from Te Tiriti itself, from the text of it. They relate to it in a way that Act's Treaty Principles Bill doesn't bear any relationship to the actual contents of the treaty. Now, you can argue about some of those principles that have been developed over the years, but at least they have that basic relationship with the contents of what was agreed in 1840. And that's why this bill is a major departure from that. It's basically turning away from that, as Crown officials have acknowledged in their briefings on this.
What are our responsibilities under the principles of indigeneity? I mean, you've seen Winston Peters say that Maori are not, in fact, or don't qualify as the word indigenous because they came from somewhere else. Don't we also have specific responsibilities to the first people, and that puts the lie to the whole we're all just Kiwis, get on with it kind of idea?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And even had no treaty been signed in 1840, Māori would still have customary rights. That's part of the common law, and that's what prior to the Foreshore and Seabed Act in 2004, that's what Māori was seeking to test in the courts, their claims under native title, under customary law to the Foreshore and Seabed. So those rights exist regardless of what's in the treaty itself. And that's why suggesting that rights should solely be limited to what the Crown deigns to grant Māori in legislation is so wrong and such a deviation from where we've been going.
Vincent, could you talk about the foreshore and seabed, and because it's not just ACT who are having a crack here on the principles, it's national as well, with the Paul Goldsmith approach on this. What do you think of this national plan on the foreshore and seabed?
Well, I think it's hugely alarming because the Marine and Coastal Area Act 2011 was supposed to be the solution, the compromise to the Foreshore and Seabed Act 2004. So it established something called customary marine title, which was not outright ownership of that land. It didn't exclude parties. It did provide those groups that were granted it some rights, such as with respect to resource management, consenting processes, and so on. But Paul Goldsmith has said that there was a recent Court of Appeal decision late 2023, and New Zealand First, as part of their coalition agreement, included a provision that said that the government would overturn that ruling. And this is all about, one of the tests in the Act is that Māori have to have exercised customary rights without substantial interruption since 1840.
Which is a little tricky.
Yeah. And the court made a ruling on that in terms of the wording of the legislation, because there's another part of that that says in accordance with tikanga, and tikanga can allow groups to go away sometimes, or it doesn't require you to continuously occupy that land since 1840. So that the court exercised its judgment around that. But anyway, that ruling was appealed by the Crown and was due to be heard in the Supreme Court later this year. So, in other words, the test for receiving customary marine title hasn't even been resolved yet. The Supreme Court was due to do that later this year. And officials actually advised Paul Goldsmith, well, perhaps you should wait until the courts have made a final determination on this. Instead, they're proposing this legislation, which will not only impact future applications under that act, but it's retrospective, and so cases that are already before court now will be affected by that. So potentially that means those applications would have to be reheard, new evidence would be filed, and so on, and it's just a mess. The other thing about
it's vandalism.
Yeah,
it's legal vandalism.
The other thing about that is Paul Goldsmith, he claimed that he was restoring the original intent of Parliament. I watched some of the recent Waitangi Tribunal hearing about this, and some of the lawyers for iwi realised that he wasn't actually even a member of Parliament at the time it was passed. So how could he know what the intent of Parliament was? And apparently it was, he said it was based on conversations with people who were MPs at the time.
Yeah, right.
But his officials also said that actually this goes way beyond what Parliament intended at the time, and there's no evidence from the debates at the time that what the much stricter test you're proposing, the one that you told the seafood industry would restrict it to 5% of the foreshore, that there's no evidence that is what was said in Parliament at the time, that was Parliament's intent.
Yeah,
Vincent,
and we have Hansard for this sort of thing, which the courts, have a look at on occasion when they're trying to interpret the law. And it just seems like this is a treaty negotiations minister, a national treaty negotiations minister, who's departing in a major way from the tone or the way of operating of previous National Party treaty negotiations ministers. And I think it's worth, because there's this public view that this is just an ACT Party stunt, and we'll just have to wait for it to go away, and National will have paid their dues, if you like. But it's not just that, and there's some pretty ugly stuff going on behind the surface.
Yeah.
Vincent, I said we would talk about the book. What I was just, before you came on, I showed the nearly ridiculously solid one, and I said that I'd asked you if I needed to buy the new one as well, and you said, of course you do. There's tons of new information in it. tell us a little bit about, you've got that enormous one there. I've got your beautiful smaller book on the New Zealand wars. What's the story with this one? What's the pitch?
Well, this is sort of the little brother to the Great War for New Zealand, and it's really intended as a more accessible introduction to the topic for people who don't want the 700-page version. But as I said to you in my sales pitch to you, it does include some new material as well, and a part of that is around things like those gun turrets and what happened to them, because I think, and also what happened to the battle sites after the wars, because I think,
yes,
to me, that's a bit of a metaphor for how Pākehā thought about this history.
Well, say that, Bernard, maybe give us a good example of that, Vincent.
Well, I often say how we deal with these past sites is we run a road through them and we name it after the commander who invaded the district.
Yeah, Mercer.
And
yes.
so Arako, Rangiriri, Gate Pa and Tauranga, these are all examples of this. And it was almost like desecrating these sites, almost obliterating any physical tangents of that history. So I think that's sort of a really powerful kind of aspect of that history, which I've explored in this book, thanks to the project, the Marsden Fund project we did on how the New Zealand wars have been remembered and forgotten over time.
Vincent, Bernard wants to ask you the last question, so I'm just going to nip in and ask you, because we're going slightly longer today, because our lovely editor Simon cuts it up in a much more productive way. What was the most shocking or surprising thing that you discovered in putting this book together? I think it's sort of, you thought, hang on a minute, that you hadn't really, that you uncovered, or that suddenly had new meaning for you?
Well, I think it really came out of the big book, but was really around the war casualties, and when I worked out that they were probably higher on a relative basis than those suffered by New Zealand troops during World War One, which is supposed to be the greatest bloodbath in New Zealand history. And the casualty rate in World War One was 1.7% of the population. I very conservatively estimate that's in terms of the number killed. I very conservatively estimated here that it was more than double that. Wow. Just the level of devastation that caused, and I think also,
and the intergeneration. I mean, you mentioned in one of your books I've read that the intergenerational implications of that.
Yeah, because another aspect of this that a lot of people don't realise is prior to 1864, Tainui had a very prosperous economy. They were feeding the settlers of Auckland, exporting wheat to the goldfields in Victoria and even California. And their economy was obliterated, destroyed, crops seized, flour mills smashed up, waka pilfered, all sorts of things like that. And of course 1.2 million acres of land confiscated. One of the things I sometimes say when I'm talking to various community groups is, imagine if Fonterra today was owned by Māori, because they, a lot of their wealth is based on confiscated lands in Waikato and Taranaki in particular. So, that those losses were not ones that they recovered from lightly.
Vincent,
Bernard,
thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure. But just one final question from me. I grew up in the Waikato on one of those dairy farms, and my family grew up on another one of those dairy farms. And so I grew up not knowing much about this history. It didn't go through schools or anything like that. But for me, one of the most interesting pieces of television news that I've watched in quite a few years was last week in the coverage of the coronation, in which a good half of the whole show, at least, was about covering it, and it was done wonderfully well by four fantastic women journalists who did an amazing job. A couple of whom I've worked with in the press gallery, and who TVNZ have done a fantastic job in covering it. What did you think of the coverage, the media coverage of that day? Because it was something extraordinary from my point of view, having grown up in a place where this history just wasn't there, even though I lived in the region.
Yeah, I thought the media coverage was superb, really, and it was so informative and very comprehensive, and a great thing watching the final day, the raising up of Ngā Wai Honua Te Pō and the burial of King Tuheitia was having Tom Roa, leading tribal historian, there to explain what was going on. And you couldn't get anybody closer to the heart of the kingitanga than Tom Roa. So it was just wonderful to have him on the TV coverage. The fact that all of the media organisations were cooperating, sharing that feed and pooling their resources, and setting out the history of the kingitanga and the tikanga of what was unfolding on the marae. I just thought it was really good.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much. Sorry, Bernard, did you want to slip in another one there?
No. Because I think, and I'm guessing, I'm imagining that all those decades ago when you started looking into this, the thought of the coverage like that on New Zealand's media would have been unthinkable, or it's quite a change.
Definitely.
Well, let's hope we don't plunge now into 6 months of nasty. Well, I think we're going to, though, nasty right-wing populist material about Maoridom taking over, about excess te reo on the radio. All of the, we're going to have a very dark 6 months, I think. So it'll be very interesting, won't it, to see how the Maori Queen affects that, given her authority and her youth and experience, right?
I think so. I mean, she will. Each of those Māori monarchs has kind of developed a unique kind of approach, and I'm sure that she will as well. But she represents a new generation of leadership, the Kohanga Reo generation. And, as Mihi Forbes pointed out, I think the other day, the average age of Māori is 27. She's 27. So she represents that demographic, that future generation very well.
Yeah. Vincent, look, thank you so much for coming on. I can't recommend all of Vincent's books highly enough that we'll get, this is, you got that one. Yeah. So I've got one in my car with it all mapped out and tabbed. We do appreciate it, Vincent, and the audience has really appreciated having you on. I hope you'll come on again, and I hope the book sells, tens of thousands for the Bridget Williams Book Corporation.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
so much.
Great show, Peter.
I did have a slightly sad skateboarding dog, but should we try and whip it in and see if Simon manages to splice it all together?
Yep, just a quickie.
Yep. So it's a really sad story of the death of Hvaldimir, the beluga whale that was discovered in Norwegian waters a couple of years ago with a sort of return to St. Petersburg strap and a GoPro strap around him. And of course, what happened this week is that his body was washed up. Weirdly, a Norwegian whale protection organisation said that he'd clearly been shot to death, which I think everybody would have been rather upset about. But it turns out that he had a stick stuck in his gullet, which prevented him feeding. But I mean, he was a wonderful character. And if you look up on the internet, some of the pictures of him playing rugby with people. Some must have been a New Zealander or somebody on an icebreaker throwing rugby balls to him. But anyway, farewell. And of course, his name is a contraction of the Norwegian name for a whale and Vladimir Putin, since he was a Vladimir. Anyway, thank you, Bernard, and I'm so glad. I love those kids from the women from the asymmetrical haircuts. They're so clever, and thank you all to the audience.
Thank you very much. Ka kite ana. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.